Hey there, good evening. Nice to see you. Let's get ready for the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to reporters and writers and editors, and in this case, an Albany Bureau Chief. And we try to find out what's going on. And then in our second segments, we do writers and performers and artists. And this evening, in our second segment, we're going to talk about a movie that has taken the attention of one of the mental health institutions in the Bronx. So we're going to deal with that. But right now, we're going to talk to an old friend and colleague, and he is now the Albany Bureau Chief at the New York Daily News. So let us bring on Denis Slattery. Nice to see you once again, Denis.
Gary, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Just so I can really connect the dots here, Denis worked on the Bronx Bureau of the New York Daily News when they had a Bronx Bureau. So that's how we got to know each other after all these years. Anyway, you wrote about poverty and unemployment based on a controller report by Tom DiNapoli, the New York State Controller. So why don't you just give us the background of the report, and then we'll break it down because there were some very striking numbers about the Bronx.
Sure. So the gist of the report, Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli, as you said, he issued a report last month in December, kind of looking at poverty rates statewide. And it really kind of came down to showing that New York State as a whole has a higher poverty rate than the rest of the country post-pandemic. And within those numbers, we saw that the Bronx continues to have one of the highest poverty rates in the state. And if you look at the numbers, the overall numbers for the state, it was around 14%, I believe, double
Right.
check. And for the state, it was 24%. So it was much higher than the rest of the state. Um,
Wow.
this is something that's been an ongoing issue for years, even though we've seen poverty fall over the past decade.
Right, and let's be clear: is that you wrote an article about it with the headline which caught my attention right away. Nearly 14% of all New Yorkers live in poverty, with the most in the borough of the Bronx, and this was in early December. And there's some of the numbers. The Bronx remains the highest poverty rate at 24%. Why do you think that is? That the unemployment, or is it just very obvious if you tie poverty to unemployment and to people out of work for the pandemic, and of course the health issues? I mean, is it just very obvious why that happens?
I think you kind of touched on some of those points. One of the other reports that Comptroller DiNapoli issued at the end of the year also looked at unemployment rates. And one of the things he found was that young people of color are struggling more than others trying to find employment. So I believe he had said more than 2 years after kind of the height of the pandemic, younger New Yorkers are still facing double digit unemployment, as we've seen the number overall unemployment has fallen nationwide. But in the city, unemployment between 16 and 24-year-olds stands around 18% in the five boroughs. So
And
that's a huge part of, I believe, the poverty issue as well.
you as I mentioned earlier, had covered the Bronx extensively, so unlike maybe some other places, you pretty much know firsthand what we're talking about. How do we dig out of this? I mean, yes, we know the pandemic happened, but there are businesses, Bronx businesses, right now saying, looking to hire, saying, we need workers right there on the signs in front of their cash registers. And yet it seems disconnected that all these young men, I wouldn't care if it's young men, young women, but people are out of work. I'm not figuring this out.
There's definitely a disconnect there. It's very hard to kind of see. That's something that we're seeing nationwide as well. Um, the unemployment numbers being low, I think there's still this kind of disconnect post pandemic where employers are seeking to hire, but you have things like the minimum wage and other issues like that where people are still kind of looking. I think I'm not sure how to put that the best way, but there's also other things that are being done though to kind of combat poverty as far as like the Albany side of this. We've got
Yes,
some
go ahead.
state lawmakers who have put out different measures kind of modeled on the lapsed child tax credit that we saw. It was a federal
Right,
thing that
right.
was instituted over the past couple of years, doubling the federal child tax credit. A couple of state lawmakers have proposed doing it on the state level. So you'd be able to you
Oh,
basically see a reauthorization of a child tax credit where families in New York would receive monthly checks, roughly about $300 per child. That's something that a lot of people have said really helped a lot of families post pandemic and kind of getting back on their feet.
in order to get those things, I mean, what you have said is a really good example of the kind of thing that might help. But from a political perspective, and you're up there in Albany, so you know who's saying what. Let's, while I realize the poverty numbers in the Bronx are startling, let's not pretend that every rural area outside of New York City in New York State, from an economic standpoint, is doing well. I've spent some time in some of the upstate towns where, doing visiting and other things, and things don't look that great up there. That sort of thing would help those people too, and I don't want to get into the politics of it, but to me that sounds like a reasonable suggestion. Uh, uh, Democrats going to be able to push these things through? You feel like the governor is behind?
It's going to be very interesting. The governor's talked a lot about affordability the last couple of weeks as she
Yes.
gets ready for her state of the state. I think when you're looking specifically at the Bronx, you're also talking about generational wealth gaps too, which play a big part in this.
Very good.
And as you mentioned, some upstate rural communities, you have seen smaller towns on decline over the past, couple of decades. But the Bronx is kind of a different story where you have people who have been in poverty for a couple of generations, and that's very hard for people to get out of. So these
That
things like
that is
the child tax credit and other things like that really could help families kind of get over that hump and kind of
Yeah,
find a
your
way out.
analysis there is really, really smart, I think. I mean, the idea that it's very easy to say, okay, your family, you grew up in a family that didn't have a lot and had to struggle, and could be any number of issues that have uh, laid a foundation of poverty. It's very easy to say, well, now go do this, whereas other people have kind of a head start in that way. I could see it. And listen, we're two white guys, but there's a racial component in there,
100%. Yeah.
undeniably. We have another article about unemployment rate falling below 10% for the first time in 6 years in the Bronx. I don't know if Anderson has that. We could put that up. That was September 23rd, 2014, written by the Daily News. Talk to me a little bit about that space between 2014 and now 8 years later. The Bronx was doing so well. What were and you were covering it. What were the elements in there that kind of allowed it to happen? I wonder if we could duplicate that in some form, even though the dynamics are different.
Sure. I think going back to kind of my days covering the Bronx, and you and I spoke about this, there was a lot of investment in the Bronx over the past, 10 to 15 years. We saw the new mall open up in the East Bronx. There's a lot of investment.
The Bay Plaza. It's funny because people just know it now. They don't realize that one day there was not a Bay Plaza. That's how long we've been doing this.
It's been a while. So you have businesses like that. There's been other investments that we've seen in the South Bronx, and a lot of changes happening, obviously in the Mott Haven and Melrose areas. I think at that time, the state overall was moving towards the lower unemployment, and the Bronx obviously was when you have an area that has a more significant unemployment poverty rate, those little changes make a big difference. So
yeah, and listen, I don't recall the exact date that the minimum wage was established, and again, that's the kind of thing. It's interesting. I know that there's some movement to have the minimum wage get up to 20% in New York. And of course, other states are struggling with much lower numbers, which is pretty frustrating to see. I wonder if that had some impact as well on. But again, I'm just thinking about what you said about going back generationally for people who, if they came from a place of poverty, the pandemic made it worse and makes that much harder to move to the next step. Just since we had touched on it, do you feel? How did you feel about the governor's inaugurational address there. There's a lot going on up there. Do you think that, for example, her nomination for the chief judge is going to pass?
So it's very interesting. So Governor Hochul winning a narrow victory. She's now going to be dealing with a supermajority of fellow Dems in the state legislature, but you do have a large progressive component in the legislature. She didn't offer a lot of policy ideas in the inauguration. It was much more celebration of her win and kind of this historic moment of having the first woman elected governor of New York.
Right,
but
I get that, sure.
the next couple of weeks, we're going to see a lot more policy coming out. So we've got the state of the state coming up in about a week, and the governor will lay out kind of her policy agenda there. She's talked a lot about affordability, a lot about housing,
right,
rezoning.
I just want to go back to that chief judge thing, because those issues will reveal themselves over time and they will be debated in the legislature. But this right away, I got some material of a dozen, maybe a long list of a dozen prominent Hispanic legislators who were for it. And then on the other side, there was a pretty long list of prominent elected officials who were saying, we're not going to vote this way. There's a pretty big pull right now.
Yeah,
you have no prognostication about it? That's not fair, I know.
No, I'll definitely touch on that. So it's that's going to be kind of the first really big battle between the legislature and the government.
Yeah,
so
that's going to tell a lot.
Oh, absolutely. So she nominated Judge Hector LaSalle. He currently is presiding judge in the Second Court of Appeals to be the next chief judge of the state of New York. This really sets up a big battle. As you said, there's about a dozen Democrats in the state Senate where his nomination has to be confirmed.
What are those numbers? They need how many senators to vote yes?
So 11. They could lose 11. So they're already at a point where they could stop the confirmation.
You know what's ironic, Dennis? This is somewhat off the trail here, and we only have a moment left. But what's ironic is that the pull in the House of Representatives to get a new speaker mirrors this, a mirror, because it's the opposite party, that there's an extreme wing, so to speak, that's pulling in one direction and not letting kind of the status quo do its thing. And obviously the same thing's going on in the House of Representatives. Anyway, Dennis, you and I this conversation was almost like sitting at the bar or sitting at the bagel shop, if you will. And maybe if I get up to Albany, we'll get a chance to do that. Denis Slattery, the Albany Bureau Chief of the Daily News. Listen, I know that you got to write about the state as much Bronx as you can. We want that, because then it gives me an excuse to have you here.
I will do my best. I promise you that. Thank you so much for having me.
And I hope it's good news from the Bronx. Like, the unemployment rate just plummeted. What are you going to do? Anyway, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to go to Mosaic Mental Health, and we're going to talk about this very interesting and very important film that is going to be shown. So we'll take a break. We'll be right back.